On September 6, 2025, the city of Kyiv awoke to a nightmare unlike any it had experienced since the war began. In the early hours, the sky was filled with the deafening roar of explosions and the relentless wail of air raid sirens. Over 800 Shahed drones, accompanied by 13 advanced missiles, rained down in a meticulously coordinated Russian attack, overwhelming the city's defenses and shattering the fragile sense of normalcy that had returned to the capital in recent months. This barrage marked a brutal and deliberate escalation, targeting not only military installations but also the very heart of Ukraine's government and the daily lives of its civilians. The attack was designed to instill terror, disrupt leadership, and send a chilling message to the world. Emergency services raced through the chaos, navigating debris-strewn streets to reach scenes of devastation. At least 5 people, including a helpless infant, lost their lives, while more than 44 others suffered injuries, some life-threatening. The true toll, both physical and emotional, was only beginning to emerge. For the first time, the government complex in central Kyiv, home to Ukraine's cabinet, was struck directly. Its historic halls, symbols of national resilience, were engulfed in flames. The attack left no doubt. Moscow was willing to cross new lines, escalating the conflict to unprecedented levels. The devastation was not limited to Kyiv. Cities across Ukraine, Kryvyi Rih, Dnipro, Kremenchuk, and Odessa, were also pummeled by strikes. Critical infrastructure, from power plants to transportation hubs and port facilities, was left in ruins, underscoring Russia's calculated intent to cripple Ukraine's ability to function and resist. Ordinary civilians bore the brunt of the assault. Families huddled in bomb shelters and subway stations, clinging to one another as the city above them shook. Air defense crews worked tirelessly, but the sheer volume of projectiles overwhelmed even the most advanced systems, leaving many targets exposed. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The sense of safety that Kyiv's residents had slowly rebuilt was obliterated in a single night. Streets once filled with life were now deserted, and playgrounds lay in ruins. This attack was a bold and unmistakable rejection of recent peace overtures. Instead of dialogue, Russia chose escalation, signaling to Ukraine and the world that it was prepared to intensify the conflict, regardless of the cost. For Ukrainians, the events of that morning were a grim reminder that the war's most violent and uncertain chapter may still lie ahead. Grief and fear mingled with a renewed determination to endure. The world watched in shock and alarm as the conflict entered a new, more dangerous phase. International leaders condemned the attack, but the path forward remained unclear. As darkness fell over Kyiv once again, the days ahead promised only uncertainty and fear, with millions left to wonder what tomorrow might bring. President Donald Trump's response to the Kyiv attack was swift and blunt, capturing the attention of the world within moments of the news breaking. He wasted no time in addressing the press, his tone grave and his words carefully chosen to convey the seriousness of the situation. He called the attack a terrible humanitarian disaster, emphasizing the immense suffering inflicted on innocent civilians and the scale of the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. Trump went further, describing the events as a horrible waste of humanity. His words reflected not just political outrage, but a deep sense of personal frustration and sorrow at the loss of life. Visibly frustrated, Trump reiterated his belief that the war could be ended quickly, insisting that decisive action was needed to bring the violence to a halt and restore peace to the region. But he also admitted, "I'm not happy with what's going on there." His candor revealed the limits of diplomacy and the growing impatience within the White House. His condemnation of Russia was unequivocal, signaling a shift from negotiation to a more forceful approach. Trump's language was sharper than before, leaving little doubt about his administration's stance. Trump's words were closely watched by allies and adversaries alike, hinting at a new phase of American policy. The international community braced for what might come next, aware that U.S. leadership would shape the global response. By framing the attack in stark human terms, he aimed to galvanize international opinion and lay the groundwork for a tougher response. The world's media echoed his statements, amplifying the urgency of the crisis. The president's anger marked a turning point. His patience with Russian aggression had run out. The sense of outrage was palpable, and it was clear that a line had been crossed. The world now awaited not if, but how, the United States would respond. Every statement, Every gesture from Washington was scrutinized for clues about the next steps. Economic pressure was on the table, with new sanctions and financial measures being discussed behind closed doors. The severity of America's next move was the question on everyone's mind, as military and diplomatic options were weighed late into the night. The stakes had never been higher, and the world watched anxiously as history unfolded in real time. To grasp Trump's threatened strategy, we must understand sanctions, modern economic warfare designed to cripple an adversary without firing a shot. Sanctions freeze assets, ban trade, restrict financial access, and target vital exports like oil and gas. The goal force policy change by inflicting enough economic pain to destabilize the regime or limit its war-making ability. In Russia's case, existing sanctions have hurt but not broken the Kremlin. Moscow has adapted, finding new buyers and workarounds. The effectiveness of sanctions depends on international unity. Without it, embargoes leak and lose power. Trump's plan: double down, close loopholes, and escalate pressure until Russia faces a crisis it cannot ignore. The debate in Washington now centers on how far to go to force a change on the battlefield. After the devastating strikes on Kyiv, President Trump's patience with Moscow appeared to finally snap. The images of destruction and civilian suffering seemed to mark a turning point in his approach to the crisis. When pressed by reporters about whether he would escalate sanctions against Russia, Trump didn't hesitate. His answer was blunt and unequivocal. "Yeah, I am." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The so-called Phase 2 sanctions would represent a dramatic intensification of the U.S. response, moving beyond targeted financial measures to a sweeping, full-scale economic offensive designed to cripple Russia's ability to wage war. Trump's pivot from personal diplomacy to economic coercion is a direct result of the breakdown in recent peace talks and Russia's renewed aggression in Ukraine. The failure of negotiations has left the White House with few options. The first phase of sanctions targeted Russian banks, oligarchs, and high-tech industries. But Phase 2 could go much further, potentially imposing a full embargo on Russian energy exports and introducing aggressive secondary sanctions on any country or company that does business with Moscow. The lack of detail about the next steps is no accident. By keeping Moscow in the dark, the U.S. hopes to maintain maximum leverage at the negotiating table, forcing the Kremlin to guess what might come next. The message from Washington is clear. Continued Russian aggression will come at an unbearable cost, not just for the Russian government, but for its economy and its people as well. Around the world, leaders and citizens alike are watching closely to see whether this new economic offensive will be enough to force President Putin back to the negotiating table, or if it will push the conflict into even more dangerous territory. The stakes for Ukraine and for global stability have never been higher. Every decision made in Washington and Moscow now reverberates across continents. The next moves by both sides will not only define the future of this conflict, but could shape the course of international relations for years to come. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent outlined Phase 2 secondary sanctions targeting not just Russia, but any country or company buying Russian oil. This strategy forces nations to choose between Russia and access to the U.S. market. The goal: sever Russia's energy lifeline, which funds its war. Despite price caps, buyers like China and India have kept Moscow afloat. Secondary sanctions would make these deals risky and expensive. The U.S. has already tested this, slapping a 50% tariff on India for Russian oil purchases. Bessent's aim: trigger a full-blown economic crisis in Russia, forcing Putin to the table. It's a high-stakes gamble. Success could end the war, but risks alienating key partners and destabilizing a nuclear power. The administration is betting the urgency outweighs the risks. For Phase 2 sanctions to work, U.S.-European unity is essential. Without Europe, loopholes remain. Companies could reroute trade through European banks, blunting U.S. efforts. A united front would force the world to choose: the vast Western market or Russia's. Bessent's message to Brussels and Berlin: only together can we collapse Russia's economy. The combined weight of North America and Europe would leave Russia with nowhere to turn for energy sales or capital. But unity isn't easy. Europe has its own interests and political pressures. The Trump administration must convince allies that the urgency in Ukraine justifies drastic action. The fate of Phase 2 hinges on rallying the West. Amid Kiev's ruins, President Zelensky welcomed tougher sanctions, especially those targeting countries fueling Russia's war machine. He's long argued that cutting off Russia's revenue is the only way to stop the missiles and drones devastating Ukraine. Zelensky called the latest barrage a deliberate crime against civilians, urging world leaders to act decisively. Every barrel of Russian oil sold, he said, funds more destruction. He's also pushing for immediate military aid, especially air defenses, to save lives now. Zelensky's two-pronged approach strangle Russia's economy and strengthen Ukraine's defenses. For him, Phase 2 sanctions aren't just policy, they're a potential lifeline. Ukraine's hope that renewed U.S. resolve will finally make the cost of war unbearable for Moscow. European leaders, led by France's Emmanuel Macron, echoed a hardening stance against Russia. At a Paris summit, Macron accused Moscow of stalling peace and declared there would be no limitations for the defense of Ukraine. This marks a shift. Europe is now willing to provide whatever Ukraine needs, including advanced weapons and stronger economic support. The attack on Kyiv convinced many that half measures have failed. Europe's consensus is aligning with Trump's tougher approach. Phase 2 sanctions are gaining traction. Only a united transatlantic front can exert the pressure needed to change the Kremlin's course. Recent meetings with U.S. envoys show deepening coordination for a joint economic offensive. The message: Europe is ready to stand with the U.S. for decisive action. The escalation and threat of new sanctions come after repeated diplomatic failures. Recent peace talks in Alaska between Trump and Putin collapsed, with no ceasefire or breakthrough. The attack on Kyiv signaled Moscow's preference for military solutions over negotiation. Trump has tried to broker direct talks between Putin and Zelensky, but Moscow remains unresponsive. U.S. officials now believe Russia is using diplomacy as a stalling tactic while pursuing war. The deadlock is perilous. Trump's pivot to coercion is a response to Russian intransigence. The world wonders, will economic collapse force Russia to negotiate, or will it provoke further escalation? As diplomats maneuver, Ukrainians continue to pay the highest price in a war with no end in sight.